On behalf of Sky, welcome to this second introductory webinars to agroecology. And just a quick background to remind ourselves what is Sky all about and why this series of webinars. So Sky, the Seed and Knowledge Initiative, is a regional partnership of 16 organizations in Southern Africa that aims at promoting farmer-led systems and agroecology in the region, because we believe this is the only way to restore balance and justice in our food system and in our relationship with the rest of the planet, as well as achieve sustainable food and nutrition security. Sky partners are mostly local community-based organizations or NGOs with a long-standing work experience with smallholder farmers in the region. But we also have advocacy organizations and research institutions. If you want to know more about Sky, we invite you to go to our website, and maybe Nick can also put the Sky website address in the chat box. One of our objectives at Sky is to contribute to building and strengthening an agroecology movement in Southern Africa. And so the objective of these webinars is really to start reaching out to other audiences, but outside, beyond the Sky family, other farmers, other agricultural practitioners, but also other sectors like government, environment, health, education, social welfare, and so on. And also simply reaching out to any citizens concerned by the state of our food system and our environment. The other objective of these webinars is also to start testing the interest and meeting possibly interested candidates for a deeper, more experiential, longer course that we are in the process of designing for July 2021. And the objective of this course is to train a new group of agroecology activists to join us in leading this agroecology movement in Southern Africa. So last webinar, my colleague Elfrida explained a bit more about the course. Yeah. I want you to go to the recording of the webinar number 1 that is on our Sky YouTube channel if you want to know more about it. Otherwise, also the next webinar will touch on it a bit more again. Now I'd like to introduce very briefly the rest of the team that is behind the organization of this series of webinar. It's actually in the course, and it's comprising of Nelson Mudzingwa from Zinsof, John Zira from Ukuvuna, Lawrence Mkalipi from Biowash South Africa, Vanessa Black from Biowash South Africa, Shepherd Mudzingwa from Fambizana Permaculture Center, Chifundo Kokwa from Scope Malawi, Jackie Van Niekerk from UCT, Precious Piri from Regeneration International, and in the Sky team, it's Elfrida, myself, with the support of John Wilson, and also the behind-the-scene people, very important, Nick and Ruby, who you communicated with through the registration process. For this specific webinar, the team is Shepherd, Lawrence, John Zira, Vanessa, and myself, and also the support of John Wilson. It's really nice to see all of you again, and new people as well, and to see also the support of other Sky partners in the list of participants. Thank you very much for your interest again and participating in this webinar. Very quickly, the program that we have lined up for you today, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and share with you short PowerPoint presentation. So this second webinar, so last time we had the first webinar called Why Agroecology, and the idea was really just to give you an idea of what agroecology is all about and the breadth of agroecology. This one is a bit more deepening the understanding and especially focusing on agroecology as a science and as a practice. So we've got 3 hours to do that. And we'll start with a welcome and introduction session. This is what we've been doing, but I'm going to be joined by Vanessa as well, just to do a very short recap on webinar 1 for the new people, but also as a reminder for the people who were there last time. Then second session will focus on the principles of agroecology, the scientific principles, and it will be facilitated by Lawrence. And you will have the opportunity to discuss those principles in a group and then report back in plenary. Then session 3 will focus on the science of agroecology and will be led by Shepherd. You will hear about a bit of background of the scientific approach to agroecology, but also the importance of the diversity of life forms, the various cycles in nature. You'll hear about holistic approach versus reductionist approach, and also a bit about indigenous knowledge systems and their role in understanding agroecology. Then in session 4, we're going to have an overview and a few examples of agroecological practices, and this will be led by Walter from Rescope. So these are some of the practices that you're going to hear about: fertilizers, green manure and cover crops, soil health practices, water harvesting, organic pest and disease management. And finally, we're going to wrap up with Jackie, who's going to take note of the main messages and highlights of the 3 hours. And we'll also start talking about the next webinar and the preparation that you will have to do for it once again. We'll have a break after the Science of Agroecology session. And I also want to highlight the 2 interactive sessions where you will have the opportunity to ask questions, engage with the presenters and with the Sky resource person in attendance. So really, when you listen to all these presentations in session 3 and 4, write down your questions, and there will be time for you to engage directly on some of this sharing. So that's the program, very packed as you can see, and hopefully we're not going to go too much over time. So I think that was my part, and I will now hand over to Vanessa for the recap on webinar 1. Over to you, Vanessa.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see. So we're basically doing a quick recap of what happened in webinar 1. Steph, can you see it fine?
Yeah, we can see it. There's just this small little box window away from, but otherwise we can see it.
Yeah, I don't know why that is there. Okay, let me
It's
see.
okay.
Let me just try again.
Maybe it's going to be our little companion.
There you are, maybe that's better.
Yeah,
so in webinar 1, we had an introduction to why we're doing this series of webinars, as Steph's already mentioned. And the key aim is to strengthen the knowledge, skills and mindsets of agroecology activists towards them playing a greater leadership role in agroecology and the movement in Southern Africa. Oh, now I've got the problem of it not moving. Sorry, it's not moving on again. There we go. All right, and then we had a session where we reflected on how you understood and defined agroecology based on your homework, with Chifundo sharing some of the diagrams that you drew and your definitions. We then looked at where agroecology had come from, the history from the first use of the term in 1928, and then its further application in terms of an ecological science to farming, to agricultural landscapes and food systems, and the rise of the global movement advocating agroecology as the key element in the construction of food sovereignty. And very importantly, we defined agroecology as both or all of a holistic approach that includes a science, a practice, and a movement. So it's a participatory, action-oriented, and holistic approach, integrating transdisciplinary science, a set of practices, and a social movement, seeking to bring about food system transformation. And the kind of transformation that we're aiming for is what we define as food sovereignty, which is to enable communities to define their own food and agricultural systems and to produce healthy and culturally appropriate food through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. We then spent some time looking at how the industrialized food system is at the center of a number of crises that we face in our current time, especially climate change, biodiversity loss, the toxic pollution that it brings about, and corporate power and concentration, and growing hunger and malnutrition that we see, and how in particular this has come to the fore during the COVID crisis, and how we see during this crisis that the industrial food system is really failing us. Then we had some input from 3 farmers and why they see agroecology as really important as well from their farmer perspective. So we had Nelson Mudzinga, who spoke about the high cost of industrial inputs and how that's beyond the reach of most farmers in our region, and how that system is impacting our climate and our natural ecosystems and the degradation of systems we see around us. And then he mentioned how agroecology is the solution to that, drawing from our traditional knowledge and how it can then restore our environment and our nutrition. And he also stressed the importance of learning from each other, building the movement, and farmer to farmer learning as a key way to share what we know. Elizabeth Mpofu shared why it is important to fight for food sovereignty, so one can be in control over how we produce food and the quality of the food that we eat. And Mavis Mhleko shared how important her agroecology is to her family's food security and health, and the independence this gives her. We then went on to explore the breadth of agroecology to try and give you all a taste of the very many aspects of it and the diversity of agroecology through some of the participants in Sky and other partners. And we started trying to share or trying to have Gertrude Shwarai Jabson give us input, but we had a bad connection. And just to say for the people who missed it during the live webinar that Gertrude did record her input and it was included on the recording that's on YouTube if you would like to go back. But Gertrude, in summary, spoke about how agroecology connects us with our indigenous knowledge, African spirituality and culture to restore the balance that has been lost between human beings and the earth of which we are a part. So it's in all regions going back to that culture and that connection with nature that we have lost. so that we can learn to play our part within nature and to enter into respectful relationship with the myriad of other living beings and life forms, instead of seeing them as resources to be owned and used. Then we went on to Maya Marshak, who unpacked for us how modernist science and thought that had arisen from as long ago as the Enlightenment has carried through into current global life, and how that modernist science helps in this separating humans from nature and separating the world into parts, and which puts nature to work for humans instead of connecting us, and how that has been co-constructed with colonialism to have power over people and landscapes. And that this modernist thinking is what carries through today, shaping modern agriculture and also the green revolution thinking that is damaging our planet, which emphasizes external solutions and experts and input production. And agroecology is trying to counter this by bringing back other ways of knowing, where farmers are co-creators of knowledge and where social and ecological well-being is prioritized, not just production and productivism. We then went on to hear from Juliet Nangamba, who highlighted how global diets are becoming uniform based on only a few species of crops and foods, leading to a loss of biodiversity, but also rising malnutrition. And she shared how agroecology can address both diversity and nutrition by supporting species diversification and enhancing functional diversity and beneficial interactions from the soil to the gut. We then heard from Dora Marema, who gave us a perspective from urban perspective from the Ubuntu project in Johannesburg, which responded to the lockdown food crisis that people were experiencing by connecting agroecological producers to hungry families, but then went a step further by not only sharing food baskets, but also sharing seedlings and seed and skills with those families so that they could also become food producers. We then heard from Annie Chikanji, who gave us a glimpse of how Rescope in Malawi work with youth in schools to grow food. And the schools provide a good place to demonstrate and showcase agroecology, and are very important because youth learn very quickly and also take that knowledge back into their families and communities. We then heard from Esther Lupafia, who shared their work in Malawi as well on participatory dialogue approaches and approaches to center gender in food and nutrition, and how they work through community dialogue to address gender roles and structural issues and inequities that affect rural women and men's potential. So going into dialogue with both men and women to address these issues, both in the community and in the broader context. We then heard from Walter Nika, who explained why Sky Partners are now starting to look beyond the farm and to look at the social and ecological systems as a whole that affect farming communities, and to transition these to holistic and well-functioning agroecological landscapes. And this work tackles bigger processes around community commons, for example, water, catchments, communal grazing, and harvesting from wild areas to improve the health of the whole landscape and the community and life within it. And then we heard from Peter Gubbles, who presented learning from the work of Groundswell International to scale out agroecology to address the climate change and land degradation crisis. And they work in West Africa. And this included seeing scaling agroecology as a developmental approach to develop a resilient farming system. And it goes beyond, he stressed, the teaching of just a few techniques, and stressed that it must be progressive, it must address social issues and ensure the inclusion of marginalized people and build local skills and ownership, and use working examples to leverage broader support. Then we went into a wrapping up session, which was with you as participants reflecting on what you had heard and raising questions. And I'm just going to sum up some of the issues that came up. So you emphasized the focus on justice in agroecology, the power and importance of solidarity, togetherness, and creativity, the need for cooperation and sharing of ideas and examples from different contexts, because we have diverse contexts and agroecology responds in a diverse way, that the evidence is inspiring to see and that we need good evidence and leading by example, and the power of a good video to show that. We stressed the holistic nature of agroecology and how the webinar had shared this, and all the different aspects are connected, and how important it is to know and understand the principles of agroecology, because these are applied in very different ways in practice in our different contexts and localities. We also said how there's little time to do much and how we need to scale out agroecology, including to a landscape level. And participants mentioned that we see how damaging the other systems are at a landscape level, and we would like to know more about how to work in this way. The importance of women was also mentioned in terms, and also gender equity, for example, in land ownership, which is very skewed in Africa, and the need for buy-in from leadership and communities to be successful, and how to, there was a question around how to get government participation and policy that is more supportive of agroecology. Sorry, it's just struggling to move on again. I just wanted to share, oh, there we go. Just to remind you all that if you missed anything last time, you can see webinar 1 on the YouTube channel. And the final part of last webinar was to leave you with a homework task, where we asked you to go into a natural area and observe the relationships and patterns that you could see in that natural area. And I'm now going to hand over to Lawrence, who will take up the homework task with you and take this further. Thanks.
Thank you, Vanessa, and good afternoon to everyone present here today. Vanessa has given us a background and a summary of where we come from webinar 1, as well as to present the homework. As now we know that agroecology has got 3 legs, one of practice, the other one is science, and the other one is movement building. Now we are approaching agroecology as a practice. But then before we start that, we need to understand the principles, which are displayed on your screen. And we must link these principles to your homework that we have been asked to do from webinar 1. And for us to do that, I am going to leave this principle on the screen, and each facilitator will take us through one of each after we've been divided into group discussions. We'll be dividing ourselves into 5 sections or 5 groups so that each group could take one of these principles. The facilitators from Sky will take us a lead on this. And then after 50 minutes, we will be able to come back and the rapporteur will be able to share what the group came out with. In these 5 principles, it's very important to look at what was your homework, as it's been explained by Vanessa. For now, I will ask Nick to take us through our group divisions so that we can break into group before we go to the practice of agroecology. Thank you, Nick. Can each group share with us 3 minutes what came out from group discussion? I'll start with group 1, John Zera's group.
Okay, someone is presenting. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. So we were discussing balance and optimizing nutrient flows within systems by enhancing recycling of biomass. And I think the essential bit that came out from that is that the waste from one element should be food for something else, or that basically output can and should be input. Everything has a use if planned properly or with the correct systems put in place. And quite often it's just about either mimicking or strengthening existing natural systems. And this might be something that's perhaps more familiar to smallholder or subsistence farmers than larger commercial farmers. Some examples are obviously animals and manure and earthworms that are doing their work anyway, but we can even put them to use, specifically to create biomass or biofertilizers. And yeah, it's about closing the resource loops or recycling existing nutrients into the systems, but we can also enhance them ourselves. So it's very much enhancing or strengthening or optimizing existing systems with a bit of time and implementation, but also protecting the soil. So through technical interventions such as mulch or drainage lines and swales, etc., to protect the soil and enhance the natural systems that are occurring, or at least to minimize the risk that they're facing. And lastly, that households and farms can be structured in such a way that their waste is put to good use, so anything biodegradable, and that hopefully moves into a mindset shift as well.
Thank you. Thank you from group 1. I hope everyone had the presentation. Can we then go to group 2, which is going to hear Rikai from group 2?
Hi, thank you, Lawrence. I'm Rikai from group 2. We were discussing the role of soil conditions and how to support and create healthy living soil systems. And 5 of us discussed the role of protecting soil, but also building soil, and a number of elements and dimensions came up. We talked about the role of watering, also about decomposition and mulching, the decomposition of biomass, and also the role of composting. We discussed microorganisms and the interplay that they have with plants and soil, the transfer of nutrients and supporting each other. We also talked about how to protect soil through cover crops and always looking to have no bare ground, and also perhaps one of the most important things is to see soil as a living system, and that part of our role is to help facilitate the natural systems that promote good soil health. And so these were the elements that we discussed, that we thought support good, healthy living soil. Thank you.
Thanks, Rekai. That was very good and quick. Can we hear the group 3 from Shepherd Group?
Okay, thank you. We have discussed on principle number 3, and we looked at the principle of conservation, where we actually discussed that we have to learn from nature, as nature is our best teacher who can teach us how to work with it in the right way, so that we have a system whereby all the resources which are found in nature work on their own and support life on Earth. We actually focus on very important life which is found on Earth, like the bees, which are very important for the existence of human life. But if you look at the bees, they are now dying in large numbers, and the population is decreasing every day. So it's important that we think about how to maintain the bee population and other organisms which are important in the cycling of matter in the ecosystem. We also look at that we operate in a closed system, and the elements which are there in the system are interdependent. They depend on each other, and if one element is removed from the system will not function. So our designs have to maintain a closed system where these elements will work together very well. It is clear from our discussion that we operate in an output system, whereby outputs of one system will be inputs to another system. Like, for example, we have an output from the trees, which is oxygen, which is important, oxygen, which is important for human life. Without that output, no human existence will continue. So it is important for us to design a system where we improve the efficiency of this system. So we look at a balanced ecosystem where we have relationships which are clear and well connected, looking basically at the 4 ecological blocks which we have to maintain in our design so that they function very well, so that at the end of the day we have a good flow of energy, we have a good water cycle, and all the cycles are maintained. So we discussed that our designs have to maintain all this in position, because there is nothing which can operate on its own, but all these are in a closed system and they are interdependent. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I wonder if anyone understands the 4 ecological zones. We'll unpack that later. Next group is group 4 with Vanessa.
Hello, I'm Lunga. I'm reporting on how to promote functional diversity of the systems that include species and interspecies below and above the ground in time and space. So we spoke of our little observations, where we spoke of things like we observed terraces and vermicompost and legumes that are growing, pawpaws, and acacia trees, lemon trees, and stones, and companion planting where food systems are growing, and we also saw that then the coexistence of animals with plants together, and features such as ponds and things, and how everything was organized so that there was life on the water and life on the trees, and certainly life, even though not observed under the soil. That's the topic of functional diversity and the examples of it, where we saw food that grows sustainably and to sustain people, but also let life exist, such as having a fence to grow food on, such as beans, passion fruit grasses, but also to protect the garden from strong winds, the ponds that collect water, like wastewater, and wasted water, rather, not wastewater. Wasted water provides space for animals such as frogs and things to control some of the pests that happen in the garden, spiral heads from that are made out of rocks that allow a little bit of habitat for the snakes to enjoy the shining sun, but also help to combat rats and other rodents or pests in the garden. We also spoke about companion planting systems where vegetables and other plants are helped by the scent that other plants are giving off, and trees like acacias that give mulch, and then also the vermicomposting systems that are helped by the acacia trees shades, and also because they are legumes, they also give nitrogen in the soil. So that's where we saw this give and take kind of a system, and then so therefore it's not just diversity. Actually, it's diversity that is able to act, but also a function which is food and pest control, but also strong ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Group 4. Group 5, which was facilitated by Walter. Thank you.
Thanks, Lawrence. I'll do the feedback. It's Jackie. Our principle was very much around relationships or connections and interactions and synergies. So we thought that our principle was at the heart of agroecology, as building relationships are key for working with biodiversity. The soil-water relationship is very important. We had an example of using grey water in the garden. All of these enhance beneficial mutual relationships. Plants and animals also have relationships. For example, we receive many things from plants, but we as humans also provide for the plants via animals, so we can give them manure to grow better. Plants clean the air, and plants create a habitat which also draws animals. Then finally, good soil, so the microbes in the good soil supports life, which then supports plants, and those plants support the animals. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was good. We are almost 5 minutes above our time. Can we ask our group of Sky, Stephanie, to highlight what is it that we have heard from the groups? And then later, Vanessa next will tell us what does it mean? What does this principle mean to us? But let's hear from Steph what we heard from you as a group. Thank you. Steph?
Thanks, Lawrence. Yeah, I think I'm going to be very brief because the feedback was already a kind of a summary of what the discussions that happened in the groups. Maybe I'll just put some keywords for each principle, and then Vanessa can bounce on those keywords and provide some more insight. So Vanessa, are you ready? I think I'll do one principle, then I'll leave you the floor, and then we go to the second and so on. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, let me try. You start and I'll try and share screen.
Yeah, maybe yeah.
Okay.
So on principle number 1, I heard words like waste can actually be food for something else. Everything has a use. We need to optimize the system and use everything that is in the system. I heard example through the animal manure and earthworm, and the importance of really protecting all the resources, especially the soil, and minimize losses. And basically see everything as being recyclable, and anything that is biodegradable, return it into the system because it can be of good use. So does it sound like the group 1 understood principle number 1 correctly, Vanessa?
Yes, so I heard them say that it's also about protecting the soil in order to create the conditions to do those optimizing. But they also overlapped, and I think this is the tricky thing with these principles, is that they often, the examples have many principles within them, so they could be fall under more than one system. But they gave, for example, the worms working to optimize nutrient flows and enhance that recycling. So that overlaps a little bit with some of the other principles of connection and relationship. I just wanted to share under this one that the nutrient cycle includes the biological processes, but also broader processes in the atmosphere, taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and bringing that into soil, and the freeing of minerals from the rocky substrate that the plants do. And so that's all part of the nutrient cycle that we are trying to optimize and keep cycling. And there's different ways that people do it. I've shared here an example looking at the forest system, which recycles nutrients within the system and keeps that process going. So the leaf litter gets eaten by the microbes, and then that becomes available to the forest system again. And then how that is applied in agroforestry systems, where people are trying to get those deep nutrients into the ground and back up, which is very different from monocultures that do it in a very surface way, but also allow those nutrients to disappear. And they just disappear from the system. Thanks, Deb.
Okay, so principle number 2. So yeah, they recognize the centrality of the soil and its role in supporting any living system, and hence the need for protecting but also building the soil so that it can sustain life. Example of techniques or practices I heard was mulching and composting. They also mentioned the role of microorganisms in the soil, and cover crops as a technique to protect the soil. And a key rules being no bare ground whatsoever. So really the importance of promoting soil health so that we have healthy living systems at the end.
Yeah, and I think they also mentioned watering, so that's so important to have the water and the air in the soil to enable that soil life. And here just looking at the soil food web, so all the different levels of organism that eat different parts of the biomass to provide food for the next organism. And that some of them are in symbiotic relationships, so fungi that actually take nutrients from the soil that are on plant roots, for example, or bacteria that, like on legumes, that live on the roots of the legumes, but then extract the nitrogen and make it available to the plants. So it's understanding that soil building is a whole living process that also needs oxygen and needs nutrients that come from the air. So the nitrogen fixing, for example, that's taken from the air and into the ground. Thanks.
Okay, principle number 3. So some of the key words that I heard from the rapporteur was the importance of seeing nature as our teacher, and also a systemic approach to understanding flows between the different resources. One element of the system is out, then the whole design is not going to work. And the importance of building efficiency and ensuring balance in the system. And nothing can operate, separate from the system. Everything is interdependent.
Thank you. Also, what I heard them say, which I found very interesting, was that we are in a closed system. So the Earth as a whole is a closed system. And then we're designing systems within that system. So it's a collection of relationships and systems that work together. And I'm just sharing this because we often think about the on-farm, but also we need to think about the energies moving through the landscape and through our individual production areas. And I think it's also been mentioned around, for example, the water flow and how one can hold on to the water that comes through the land or falls in, from rain, in terms of designing with it, rather than allowing it to just flow out and take the resources that we need with it, like our topsoil.
Okay, principle 4, around functional biodiversity. I heard the word companion planting, coexistence of animals with plants, and making sure that we protect the garden to allow that diversity to thrive, harvesting water in ponds, arranging habitats for snakes that can be helpful for combating rat and rodent. So pest control function of diversity. Yeah, and all in all, this is what allows us to grow food sustainably.
Yeah, this is a complex one because the emphasis is on functionality. So often we think of, we talk about biodiversity and the need to increase biodiversity. But in the agroecological system, we're particularly focusing on functional diversity that can benefit the food system that we're trying to create. So there's many ways to work with it, not just thinking about the here and now, but also thinking about spatially how we can do that by making use of particular niches in the food chain, or a particular environment that's good for different species. Also looking at the horizontal distribution and vertically. So how do we go into the air and what's underground? So we often don't think about the root systems of the different plants and how they work together. But also thinking about it in terms of time. So how does the system change over time? How do you work with the seasons to get diversity between seasons and to build the landscape up into a stable landscape over time? And also in terms of the diversity of crops and animals, and looking at the diversity within species, so the varieties of different crops, or the breeds, different breeds of an animal that have different qualities and importance, which might be cultural or medicinal, many different things that those varieties or breeds would fulfill. And then I just wanted to share this picture from Peru, which is the center of origin for potatoes, and how Peruvians, because they grow potatoes in the Andes, where the environment is very different from the valley bottom to the top of the mountain, they need to collaborate as communities, because certain potatoes grow at a certain level on the mountain. And so in order to have the diversity of the potato that's for different uses, whether particular ways of cooking or cultural uses, they need to collaborate to share the potatoes that they all grow at the different level on the mountain.
Thanks. And so last principle number 5, focusing on the beneficial biological interactions and synergies. What I heard from the group is that this principle can be seen as the heart of agroecology. Which is all about relationship, connections, and synergies, and specifically mutually beneficial relationships. So there's the plant-animal relationships, but also the humans interacting with the plants and the animals, and not neglecting also tiny microorganisms, microbes in the soil that supports life, supports plants, animals, and eventually human societies.
Thanks. And really that's what makes the functional diversity work. It's understanding those relationships that are key. And here's an example from China, where there's diverse ecosystems that use what each animal or plant does. So it's where people grow rice, and the rice is flooded to grow, and they have ducks which eat the insects but also provide nutrients to the water. They also keep fish in that flooded space, which also fertilizes the rice. And it's a whole integrated system, which then has many different diverse kinds of produce that can be harvested from that system. So it's very resilient, because it's a web. It's not relying on one thing as the only output, and if that gets sick or doesn't do well, the whole system collapses. So it's about building those relationships that work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Steph. Well done, participants. That was great. Can we unmute all of us and give yourself a clap? That's also a part of working now. Thank you, guys. We are almost over time with 21 minutes. The next session now will be on the science of AE agroecology. We will then hand over to Shepherd to lead us for the next session. Shepherd, over to you. Thank you.
Greetings to everyone. Thank you, Lawrence, for such a good presentation. My name is Shepherd Mudzingwa from Fambizanai Training Center in Harare, Zimbabwe. I will be taking you through the presentation on agroecology as a science, which is one of the main areas that we are covering in this particular webinar, where we want to look at the different aspects of science that relates to agroecology, and how do we relate this and all this to agroecology and the principles that we have been discussing. I'm glad some of the things that we have been talking about is actually, we are supposed to be talking about, is actually being discussed in various presentations. And maybe just also to highlight that this one is just giving us a taste of what is supposed to be covered within a 1-month agroecology training course, which is scheduled for next year. So we are likely to focus on the key aspects that are going to be covered in that particular course. And we might not get into full details, but we'll just give highlights of those presentations. So allow me to share my presentation. I think my presentation will be in various parts and contribution from different people giving their sides of the stories around different aspects. So I'll share my screen. Allow me to share my screen. Just to check with Steph, are you able to see my screen?
It's coming, but it's not there yet.
Do I have to restart, or I can?
Maybe because your presentation is quite big, so maybe it's taking a bit of time.
Otherwise, try and unshare and reshare.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
And you have to go into the application window and pick the particular file.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Yeah, still coming.
Maybe you can share it from your screen, Steph, and we will make a presentation from there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me try.
Maybe while we're waiting, or they come. They come.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
You just
great.
need to go full screen.
Yes, I think we are good to go, and I will make my presentation on the introduction. Agroecology is a science, and as highlighted before, those are my details from Harare, Fambizanai. And I'm going to take you through just briefly on the historical background, the reflection, I think Vanessa, in a previous presentation in the last webinar, touched on the background of agroecology. But today, I think we are focusing much on the science aspect of it as a discipline. I think taking it back to years, in the years of time, in around 1920, you realize that the development of agroecology, it actually started from a scientific background when Bensmik in 1928 started working on field plots, where they're doing trials on the descriptive nature of how interactions are working about in a field between different plants and relationship between different plants. That's when they all started. So the starting point of agroecology is actually a scientific background, which is starting from science and looking at science. And if you look at science from this starting point, we are looking at different forms of life and their interaction in the different species. And it's a bit different from our understanding of science, where we are looking at science from the perspective of atoms. But now, the moment we talk of different forms of life and their interaction, we will be talking science. We are into science. And you realize that as the time moves, people started developing, I think, in around the ecologists in around 1950, 1960, thereabout, in around 1970, when Odam introduced the agroecosystem approach, where we are looking at analyzing the different relationships in a production system, where we are trying to produce and see how these can work. That's when people started realizing that, oh, okay, there are different relationships that exist and they can be harnessed. And in those, they were then coupled with the practices that were being done by indigenous people. Indigenous people realized that, oh, okay, what we have been doing already is actually fitting in the science. It's actually a component of the science, and they started working on it. And they then developed that into a conceptual framework, which was around the 90s. And when people started developing the science aspect of it in the 90s, they then developed the framework of science. So if you look at the background of agroecology, it started as a science. And as time goes by, the people realize that, okay, for them to start working on this, they need to be in groups and they need to be organized. That's when they started developing movements. So from the development of science into the practice and into the movement, it has been a progression that has come, but the basis is on understanding of science and life as a different forms. And if you look at it from the perspective of science, we are saying we need to understand ecology as a science starting from the perspective of acknowledging that different forms of life on the earth, which are commonly referred to as biodiversity. We refer to these as biodiversity and biodiverse elements in the science. Are you there, Steph?
Yes, I am. You just need to prompt me when you want me to change the slide.
Okay, thank you. Can you move on to the next slide? I have passed probably the first two slides that we're supposed to be covering. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so like I was saying, from the perspective of agroecology, science is about nurturing biodiversity and respect to all forms of life. I think from the previous presentation, which Gertrude made in the previous webinar, she talked about different forms of life and their diverse range. And the moment we say bio means life and diversity means different forms, so we are looking at different forms of life that we can think of and that we can have a reflection on. And these different forms of life come in their different forms that we are also going to explore in this particular presentation, and how they come about and how they then influence whatever design that we come up, whatever component that we think of integrating in our system, and the relationships that exist. They are also based on understanding of different forms of life. The next slide, Vanessa. The next slide, Steph, sorry. The slide there is actually trying to give us the different forms of diversity, where we are looking at, probably my starting point will be the agroecosystem species diversity. I think Vanessa just in a previous presentation touched on different. She touched on different diversity ranges, and we are looking at in agroecology. The science aspect is not looking at just diversity, but it looks at functional diversity, where we are looking at different species. She talked about different species in having diversity in different species, so having diversity within the species themselves, where she talked about varieties and breeds, and also within the species where we talked about crops and livestock. So this is also a respect for different forms of life in this diversity range. And if we look at forest resource biodiversity, there are a lot of forestry resources that exist and different life forms in the forest that also need to be respected. We've got monkeys, we've got kudus, we've got very small living creatures that creep with the dung beetle. All those, they make part of the forest biodiversity and resources that also they have to think of. And if you go to insect and fungal biodiversity, if you look at the insect, the family of insects, there are a range of insects that we can talk of in fungi, different small living organisms. And in their diversity, they interact in their different ranges and diversity. And we also need to have a respect of those forms of life and how they survive. And it's another broad aspect of science that we think of and have to understand. It is from this angle that we have an understanding of how an insect becomes a pest. The definition of science to say this element was actually created to be feeding on my kale, but the moment it starts feeding on my vegetable, it becomes a pest. So it becomes something that is defined by human beings. But originally we are looking at understanding that as part of an ecosystem and as a living organism that gives different forms of life. And we also relate to soil organisms, different soil organisms. I think we're going to touch more on the different soil organisms, so I might not have to dwell much on this one. And we look at also aquatic diversity. In scientific studies, the conventional scientific studies have actually documented that there are more species in the aquatic space than on the soil surface. There are a lot of living organisms that live in water, and they come in different forms. And we also need to have an understanding of how these operate and their interaction and their relationships, and get these relationships to be functional and beneficial to all of us. And not also forgetting the grasslands and wetlands. I think this one is also a very hot topic in different areas where people need to understand that grasslands and wetlands are part of an ecosystem. Without them, we're actually substituting one of the key elements of a functional diverse system, and removing them within it will create chaos. I think I've heard from the previous group that saying we don't have to remove an element from a design, otherwise we'll create chaos. So it's some of those things. If you realize in our modern communities, people are actually working around destroying these grasslands and wetlands, but to their own problem. I think we can move on to the next slide, Steph. Okay, allow me just to have a short overview of the different life forms that exist in the soil. And on the picture there, I've just tried to picture it at different levels, and just to give us a picture. Unfortunately, the invisible ones, we can't see them, and I've only pictured the visible ones, where we are talking about the worms and the different types of worms that are found in the soil. And these elements that are found in the soil as living, they've got different roles that they play. And we've got bacteria, we've got fungi, we've got protozoa, we've got nematodes, which we can't see by the eyes. They've got also a role that they play in the soil. And we also have to understand that plant roots can also be considered as a soil organisms. And this one is in the view that they provide a symbiotic relationship and interactions with the different soil components. For example, the nitrogen fixing bacteria, the rhizobium bacteria species, they thrive on the availability of leguminous crops. If we don't have legumes, roots in the plant, they will not thrive. So that symbiotic relationship they also ride on that symbiotic relationship for their benefit. That's one of the key things. So in that space, they also make part of the soil biology. And I think Vanessa in her previous presentation also touched on the different aspects of soil organisms and how they relate, and the relationship that exists between those in a system. And the science of it is about understanding those relationships and how they can be beneficial, how they can be made functional for our own benefit. For example, I think we have an understanding of how worms work will give us a product that we can actually use, which is a vermicompost, using worms for composting, and it's tapping into the natural characteristics of degrading and removing some hazardous substance from an organic matter and use that as beneficial. So if you look at agroecology, we are not looking at just worms as an element. We're actually benefiting on their biological makeup to have something that is functional out of them. And that's all about these different elements. Understanding each and every element in the soil can actually give us a positive for our own benefit. Next slide. Here we are looking at from the perspective of soil, what are the elements that we can talk of that can actually assist us in assembling assembling a functional biodiversity. Where we are looking at a health ecosystem, it starts from what is it that you are putting in the soil. Let's say we are looking at an agroecosystem. Agroecosystem, we are looking at a system from where we are trying to produce for survival of different forms of life. We are producing, let's say, our food from the land, and we need to enhance soil fertility. And there are different ways of enhancing soil fertility and ensuring that we add organic matter in the soil, and different ways of adding organic matter in the soil. But this addition of organic matter will also have an interaction with the pest and disease regulation in the field. The moment we have limited organic matter in the soil, the plant becomes unhealthy and it's prone to attack by pests and diseases. So there's need for creating a balance. The moment you address soil fertility, you also need to take into cognizance that it has got a bearing on pest regulation. The moment you add a lot more of organic matter, it will weaken the plant as well and create an imbalance of within the system and create more pests. So there's need to balance between soil fertility and pest regulation by ensuring that the practices that we are doing or activities that we are doing to maintain pest population and enhance soil fertility, they are balanced as well. So in essence, the holistic aspect of it is we are taking both soil enhancement and pest regulation at once. You cannot choose to focus on crop diversity and forget about what are the factors that we are using to enhance soil fertility. You cannot choose on soil fertility and forget about crop diversity. And this synergy will actually give us a healthy plant. And this healthy plant will create also a healthy ecosystem from where we can tap into different forms of food sovereign food systems that we can think of. The food systems that we then develop, they're actually developing from a health ecosystem that would have emanated from a. So the systems approach is one that works when you are dealing with biodiversity. Thank you. And next slide. Steph. Okay, so this one is just also a highlight from the previous presentation where we are saying Odam introduced the agroecosystem approach in the 1970s within the time frames, where we are looking at whatever that we do in the system is based on the relationships, not only a single element of the system. So agroecosystem, we are looking at the different relationships that exist between different forms of life. And within different forms of life, one of the most often forgotten form of life is the livestock. how do we integrate animals in the design? Animals also play a very key important role, and their integration in the design, they've got also a scientific backup or scientific background on it, which is very important, and you need to tap into that. I think, can you assist us having a presentation from Precious on the role of animal management in the landscape?
Hi, Shepherd. I'm going to take screen control and I'll start Precious's video shortly.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Precious Piri. I am talking to you from Zimbabwe. I'm working with Regeneration International, an international network for all regenerative agriculture, including agroecology, holistic management. And by practice, I'm an educator in holistic management, accredited for a communal curriculum with Savory Institute. So it is my hope that today our small sharing will be helpful, and I hope that you're enjoying the whole class in general. So I'm just here briefly to give you an overview of the thought processes behind the holistic management framework. Okay, so before we jump into our short overview today, I want us to talk a bit about what we, I'm sure, are all used to. A holistic worldview versus a reductionist worldview. The term holistic is talking about thinking of whole systems other than manipulating small parts, but understanding that every living organism or every living ecosystem is actually complex beyond our own understanding. And therefore, because it is so difficult to manage complexity, what we've done in science, we've tended to take the easier route of reductionism, which is managing smaller parts or manipulating small parts to get the yields that we're looking for from the environments that we manage. But what we have missed is the fact that when we take smaller parts of a bigger whole, we actually tend to get what we call unintended consequences, or things that we didn't think that we will get. So if you think, for example, how we've shifted in agriculture to just use synthetic fertilizers and poisonous pesticides, we are basically chasing for a bumper harvest. But then what is at stake for us to get the bumper harvest? So what cost is the bumper harvest bringing us? Dilapidated soils, poisons in our foods due to pesticides, you know. So it's basically, yeah, you know, that's just the brief part. So this picture is just showing us the same landscape, but just two pictures before, which was when we're doing a reductionist view or a reductionist management or managing smaller parts, and then the after, where you are doing holistic management. If you look at the landscapes, especially the African rangelands, we find mostly annual grasses, and then the type of farming in our farms, we just grow same type of crops, monocultures, or even the rangelands now don't have that much diversity, and then manipulating small parts so that we get the harvest that we're looking for. And we feel like we're in general control of the environment. We're not willing to learn from it. When you're using the holistic view, you get mostly perennial grasses and a diversity of plant life, animal life. You manage in whole, so you do not manipulate, but you understand that everything is interconnected in our environment. And you as a manager, you're not really in control, but you're a facilitator while at the same time learning from the environment. And then I'm just going to define holistic management briefly. I said it's a simple decision-making framework to manage complexities that come, social, economic, and biological complexities that always appear whenever we put any form of management in place. So holistic management can be used on the farms, can be used at broader landscape levels. It can also be used even by organizations to structure and spell out the kind of organizations that they want and you know, like looking even into the future. So short term, medium term, and long term. How do we want our legacy to look like? So this is in general, and this was founded by Alan Savory, a Zimbabwean ecologist, who really stumbled onto these facts when he was working as a wildlife ecologist. He was mostly looking for answers of why are African rangelands desertifying in the way that they are. And this is how he came up with the holistic management decision-making framework. So let's talk a bit about the foundations of holistic management. It is based on 4 key insights. These are the insights that will then help you how to, or what sort of tools are appropriate for your land. First of all, we have to understand that nature functions in whole, and we cannot manipulate the parts without negating what we are trying to achieve. So in the long term, it actually costs us to manipulate parts. And then there's what we call brittleness, which basically spells that all environments are different. Some environments, like where I am, we are in natural region 4 and 5 in Zimbabwe, which has drier spells for a long time. So we are in a brittle environment. Even in the dry season, our plants and our twigs and trees, they shed off their leaves, they dry off, and you can literally break them because there's no moisture anyway. And then there are environments that have moisture distributed right across the year. Those ones are called non-brittle environments. And so the organic matter decomposes differently in areas that have more precipitation and in drier areas. What we found out is in drier areas, you need animal activity in the non-growing season for animals to keep chewing the grass, putting it in their gut and moistening it, coming out as dung and urine, while their feet actually trample and open up grass roots for, grass bases, so that they may receive rain and sunlight when it rains. And then in grazing, that's concept number 3. In grazing, time is more important than numbers. So during the growing season, what is important, we've found out in holistic management, is it is more important to determine how much time each plant is exposed to a grazing animal. Because every time it is grazed, it loses roots, it loses food, and then eventually, if the animal keeps coming to the same plant over and over before it recovers, that's what then leads to what we call overgrazing. Not necessarily how many animals, because you can have a large number of animals, but for a short time, if they leave that grass plant, it benefits the grass plants and the animals, and then eventually the well-being of the environment. And then predator-prey relationships. Livestock, if properly managed, can heal the land. This is what Alan Savory learned as he was working in the African game parks, to see how the wild herbivores evolved in these African rangelands with pack hunting predators. So in our environments, we have large herds of buffalo, wildebeest, and all those beautiful ones. And they are always moving around because they have lions chasing them, hyenas, and leopards, and stuff like that. So for the rangelands of the savannah, you have bigger herds that are needed, and that's the tool that we use in holistic management. But what has been the tendency? The tendency has been to blaming the tool instead of management. So we mostly blame cattle. Science has proven over and over again that cattle actually overgraze. But what if we looked at how do we actually manage the cattle? And then we will know where to direct the blame and what we need to correct. And so how we manage our livestock has an impact on the land that can either make it good or degenerate it. So I'm just going to share with you a few pictures of success where holistic plant grazing has been implemented. This is in the Karoo in South Africa. Please tell me, where does the rain more? There is no difference in the amount of precipitation, but management. This is Africa Center for Holistic Management, showing one piece of land from bare to extremely rich, and we took the last photo in 2014, and I'll leave you with this quote. Ultimately, the only wealth that can sustain any community, economy, or nation is derived from the photosynthetic processes, which is green plants growing on regenerating soils. So good luck with your class, and let's keep going with the agroecology, because it is the only way that agriculture will actually bring back our civilizations. Thank you so much. And again, my name is Precious Piri, talking to you from Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the presentation from Precious there, and thank you, Nick, for that one. I think key highlights from Precious' presentation are actually looking at the relationships of cattle and grazing lands. How do we manage these grazing lands? I think she gave a presentation on it's not the cow, but it's the how. How do we manage our cows? So the reductionist perspective is looking at the cow being a problem. What can we do with the cow? Can we eliminate the cow? What's the way of best dealing with the cow? But you realize that the holistic approach to it now is how do we manage this cattle for this cow for its survival and its coexistence with this cow? Not necessarily blame gaming, but trying to look at how we can solve the particular problem. So that's it's also good to have an understanding of the life cycle, the hydrological cycle. How does the hydrological cycle works in the different ecological processes that we can think of, the nutrient cycle, the energy flow, the succession. I think some of them have actually been highlighted by a presentation from Vanessa early this webinar. But I will touch briefly on hydrological cycle. Maybe next slide. The hydrological cycle. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the hydrological cycle, how water connects from one form to the other, moving from one point to the other. I think basically it's a cycle, and we are saying we need to keep it cycling like that, and we need to maintain that cycle in motion. Next slide, Steph. So what we are aiming when we are discussing about the hydrological cycle, it's a natural cycle that occurs, but as human beings who understand how this cycle works, we need to work on improving its efficiency and functionality. It has to function well, and we need to contribute towards its functioning well. So one of the best ways of doing it is to say water, rainwater or land precipitation needs to percolate into the soil. So we are creating a conditions that are conducive for percolation by increasing, by improving soil texture and by adding organic matter in the soil, and also maximizing life. I think earlier on presentation that will come also highlight on the role of different soil properties or different soil forms of life that are in the soil. We'll also hear to that. And it's also very important to have an understanding that from an agroecological perspective, we are not feeding the plant, we feed the soil for the soil to feed the plant. The nutrients that we are putting in the soil in the form of organic matter, they are covering multi-purpose. They are feeding the soil, but at the same time, they are enhancing the soil texture and improving the soil texture. And we also have to think of things that minimize runoff and practices that minimize runoff. And these are drawn from slowing down the movement of water. And I'm sure there's a scientific background on development of contours, which are points that are at the same height. If we dig a contour if we dig a pit on points that are at the same level, when water gets into that pit, it won't go anywhere, and it's trapped and it sinks into the underground. And the moment it sinks into the underground, it's actually improving the cycle by contributing to increased water, underground water, and efficiency of the water cycle. And things like evapotranspiration, they need vegetation for them to happen. And as we do our production on the landscape, we need to consider that the vegetation that we put there has got a bearing on the amount of rain that is going to evaporate into the atmosphere. So taking all this in a holistic manner will give us ways of how we can improve the efficiency of the functioning of this ecosystem, of this hydrological cycle. I think it's also very important to have an understanding that indigenous knowledge systems also play a key role in understanding understanding agroecology as a science. And these indigenous knowledge systems, they also contribute, these indigenous knowledge systems also contribute to efficiency in management of these ecological processes. We can have another presentation from Method, just giving us a highlight on the role of indigenous knowledge systems and how we can actually tap into the indigenous knowledge systems and them being a science of it. Over to Nick.
What about Juan Fran's presentation? Where does it come?
It's coming later in the presentation.
Later, okay.
Yes, yes.
So Nick, we need to have methods input.
Not a problem. Coming up now.
In the meantime, I just would like to remind people what I wrote in the chat. After Shepard's presentation, we'll have a Q&A discussion session for you to ask the questions you may be having or make comments. And it's really an opportunity for you to engage with all the Sky presenters and attendants. So just to remind you of that.
My name is Method Gundiza. I work with Ethno Foundation, an organization working with farming communities in South Africa and in Zimbabwe. I will speak to you about the role of indigenous knowledge and farmer local knowledge in the advancement or the enablement of agroecology. So farming is a lifestyle for the farmers that we work with. It is a lifestyle, it is a lifetime job, it is continuous, and right throughout the year or throughout someone's life, they practice farming. They are a farmer by virtue of existing. And if we go back into how farming developed, it's about how people right from the beginning learned how to forage, how to look for fruits in the forest, how to hunt for animals in the forest. When we look at this history of farming, it tells us about others knew what time to hunt which animals, what time to hunt which birds. And this is the knowledge that has evolved to the agriculture as we have it today. I'm giving this background because this is what we call indigenous knowledge. How do farmers understand when to plant? How do they understand how to plant, what to plant? And all this that we term agroecology today is the lifestyle of the farmers as they understood how to work with nature in order to produce food. The local farmer is a researcher, and they do this every day. They do this by observing, trying things, observing, trying things, and establishing connections. So there is an elder in Gangare, in Bikita, who said, when you have done your timing right to plant Jacob beans, you will not have to go and check if it is mature or not. The Mutura tree, some call it Muvumira tree, will tell you when it turns its leaves yellow, you know your Jacob beans are now ripe. So this is a constant interaction between the field and the world, and the constant observation by the farmers of what's happening in the field and what's happening in the world. Farmers see the bigger picture of the connection between the time or the moon cycle, the connection to the changes on the land when the general vegetation turns from gray to light green to deep green. And when the rivers flow, they have got full flow, they've got little flow. All these cycles in nature, the movement of the sun, what time it is, all these cycles are what determines what the farmer does. So this is looking at the bigger picture of things. It's a holistic understanding of how the cosmos and the land, more generally in the world, and the land on the cultivated space, all these are connected. And it is the understanding of how they are connected that the farmer plays with every day, enhancing their knowledge. And in the process, so it's building their knowledge and enhancing their knowledge with the understanding of the whole of how things work in the ecosystem, including the ecosystem of the land. Farmers, for example, understand that there are certain specific trees that need not be cut in the field, no matter how much you want your land clear. But there are certain types of trees that are associated with the happiness of plants on the field. This is the holistic focus, the holistic view of things, which doesn't say farming is just about producing food. It's producing food, working with nature and working in nature. I think that the kinds of relationships that farmers observe and nature are an important field for farmers, for scientists in modern day science to really explore and understand and maybe advance in terms of the sciences we have today. Farmers are knowledgeable. The knowledge they have is a product of both their observation, but also that it has been passed from generation to generation. If we are in our community dialogues, you will hear most of the elderly women will say, this is what my grandmother did. This is what my grandfather said. This is what my mother said, or this is what my mother did. So there is a knowledge which is embedded in the practice and the tradition and the culture of the people. And yet, even that is the case, there is still a constant observation that farmers make. And I think that they are great researchers in as far as they understand these things and in as far as they observe and connect them. In my experience with the elders, and I talk here about experience of going through the names of seeds, for example, in the local languages. When you go through these names, some of them speak to the local environment. I will give you an example of a variety of millet, which is the hairy one. Some call it the hairy one, and some call it the thorny one. But the local name for it in Pikita is Rushiri, which means the one of the birds. But that simply means that one won't be eaten by the birds. So when you want to plant that type of millet, and you are in an area where, for example, as was becoming the case in Bikita, other farmers had abandoned millet, then you know which variety to plant. Because then if you plant the open ones and other farmers aren't planting enough to feed the birds, and the birds will just eat up everything and finish it. But the variety of Roshiri will survive. Through this knowledge, through this understanding, one sees the connection of nature, local knowledge, social connections of family, husband and wife. When they speak to each other, they speak to each other through the name of a seed. When we do this, I think the agroecology produces a much deeper connection and an understanding to the farmers, and it becomes real. And we say this is about reconnection with ourselves, with our land, and with our environment. Thank you very much. I hope that I have been able to show the importance of indigenous knowledge, the importance of local farmer knowledge, in as far as it plays a big role in agroecology. And that we, the promoters of agroecology, do need to really learn and to bring up all these local knowledge systems in order for us to enhance the uptake of agroecology. Learning from nature, working with nature, so that we produce food that's good for the land, and that's good for our bodies, and that's good for the animals. Thank you.
Thank you, Method, for a nice presentation on indigenous knowledge systems. Steph, can you bring up a slide on the application of science by indigenous communities? I think just to sum up the presentation there from Method, indigenous communities have got their own way of handling science and how they interpret their own science. And a Method is actually highlighted some of them, but I'll just touch quickly on some. For instance, indigenous communities have indicators of soil fertility. There are plants that you see, if you see this plant in a particular environment, it indicates that this soil is fertile. If you see these plants in a particular environment, they are indicating that this soil is salty and probably unproductive. If you see this type of plants here, this soil is barren, it's not productive. You only see that plant growing on soils that are barren, that are not productive. So it is a very good indicator of barren soils. And there are also plants indicate availability of underground water. If you see that particular plant growing in that environment, it's an indication that the water table is quite close. And there's also some indicators that are used by indigenous people to determine the texture of the soil and the color of the soil in relation to the soil. And there's a whole lot of soil life that indigenous communities can have an understanding of how they function and how they work and how they can be integrated in the system. And looking at it from the perspective of creating source, they can actually have applied their knowledge. And this is highly localized knowledge within the communities. And Nick, can you assist with the presentation from Yang Tran to?
Certainly. Coming up now.
Good afternoon, friends. My name is Juan Fran Lopez. I'm from Spain. And perhaps many of you already know me in other courses or training, etc. I'm an agronomist, and I'm going to do a quick explanation about how natural ecosystem works. This is quite important to understand because if we want to practice organic agriculture, we need to understand how this natural ecosystem works, because the base or the foundation of the organic agriculture is to mimic as much as possible how this natural ecosystem works. So I'm going to do a quick presentation, and I hope that everybody can understand and is fruitful and successful. This is a olive plantation in Spain, semi-arid landscape, and you can look how the state of the soil is, and also the trees, the plantations. So what are the difference between the previous image that just I shared and this image? For understand that, we need to understand that a natural ecosystem is driven by many elements that perform many functions. So as many elements we got in the ecosystem, more relationship between them, and then more resilience will be our system. In organic agriculture, the main elements that we work with is organic matter, minerals, and biology. The relation between all of them create the true fertility. All these elements, the three main elements, are performing depending on abiotic factors that can be temperature, light, oxygen, water, air, etc., etc., etc. So these are the three main elements that we are going to work with. But we need to know what is the element of that can start this process. So the element that start this process is the sun. The sun release energy that then the plant can convert that energy plus CO2 and water in carbohydrates, sugar, and oxygen. So this is just done by the plant, the process called photosynthesis, and also by some microorganisms. So the plant build carbohydrates, but the plant release those carbohydrates between 20 and 40% in form of sugar through the root exudates. In here, what happened is underground connection between the exudates of the plants and the minerals and the microbiology. I mean, the microbiology digests the minerals in the soil and is exchanged with the sugar that the plant exudates, and the microbiology give the element that the plant needs in certain times. So we can say that the soil is the digestive system of the plant. It's for that we need to have a healthy soil. But the minerals, where are they coming from? The minerals in a natural ecosystem are coming from the bedrock. It's a long-term source of fertility. Through different physical, chemical, or biological weathering, the minerals are going to form part of the clay humus fraction. And then the last step for the digestion of minerals through microbiology, and then the minerals can be absorbed by plants, is in the soil solution. So this is how where the minerals are coming from. We can observe that for this process of the journey of the minerals, we need microbiology, who are the driver of the system. We can see that the microbiology are the engineers of the system. So we can find that microbiology, for example, the one that we work with in the surface of the soil, of the ground. So what are the main function of this microbiology, of this element? who are the driver of the natural ecosystem. The microbiology is in charge of decompose the organic matter. So, I mean, they are the recyclers. They are who put back again the organic material into the ground. Also, like just I mentioned, are the solubilizers. So they make the bioavailability of mineral and also retain nutrients in their body. The microbiology as well keep the system on balance. So they are predation or on competition for some resources, etc. And also the microbiology, the main stop of the parasite disease is through a diverse and balanced microbiology. The other element that we work with or we have to focus on for have a healthy soil will be the organic matter. The organic matter have several functions, a nutritional function or biological function. In this case, we can we can say that the organic matter is the house of the microbiology, is the shelter of the microbiology, and this affects, inhibit or develop the activity of microflora or microflora in the soil. So it's for that we need to keep high levels of organic matter on soil, and also the organic matter is in charge to retain the nutrients. A part of that, with a good microbiology and a good content, a proper content of organic matter on the soil, we increase the physical and physiochemical function. I mean, the soil structure, the texture, the aeration, or the retention of the water on the soil. So all this is that through a good process of microbiology with a proper content of minerals, and also always keeping and bringing back the organic matter to the soil again. We need to keep in mind that as more diversity we have above the surface, we will have more diversity below the surface. So it's a both ways approach. Here in the image, just I wanted to show on the left side, we have a diverse soil and the regenerative practice. This is an image in the microscope, 400 magnification. Here we can see the diverse of organic matter, of fungi, minerals, etc., etc. In contrast, on the right side, we can see a soil that just is managed through with chemical inputs. All that we can see in this image is minerals. So we can see in here in a very visual way how a diverse soil looks like under microscope and how the conventional practice deny microbiology and also deny the organic matter content. Just is focused in minerals. In here, on the left side, we can see how a soil, a proper soil, looks like when you pull out a plant. So role in the improvement of the soil. For another key point of the approach of organic agriculture nutrition is that we need to understand that nutrition, the base of nutrition is based in diversity, constant supply of elements, and those elements have to be synthesized organically. So if we make a differentiation with the conventional agriculture, we can see has this kind of agriculture doesn't use diversity of minerals. The supply is every time ago, and the synthesized are chemically. And also just to mention that the plant has different stages of metabolism to perform properly, and it's quite important to understand that the fertility in organic agriculture is not just based about elements, it's about phytohormones, organic acid, etc., etc., etc. So plant health or plant nutrition is not just about elements, it's about other compounds that we usually don't use in conventional practices. Organic agriculture is, and I said at the beginning, to bring back the balance to natural to agricultural ecosystems. So as much we mimic how to work a forest, that ecosystem of that agrosystem will be more resilient. And this is how looks, this sample is in Kenya, how looks soil under current practices. So how is this approach? Regenerative or degenerative? Improve the soil and all the ecosystem health, or degenerative all these characteristics. So just as final wrap up, we can say that agriculture is the art of harvesting the sun through photosynthesis and return back to the air what is coming from the air. That is just the trick of organic agriculture. That is the main approach. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to Jan Fran there for a presentation on how we can actually benefit from the different aspects of soil. I think it also paints a picture on the relationships that we have. Can you give me the last slide, Steph? So I think just to this presentation, before I invite any questions, we need to understand that whatever aspects of science that we think of should aim at nurturing biodiversity. We have talked about indigenous knowledge systems, we've talked about the soil, we've talked about the hydrological cycle, we've talked about the different animals, how they interact with the nature, their grazing lands, and also briefly about the cycle. Those are relationships that need to be respected. But in whatever form that we do, that in whatever aspect that we think, we need to look at nurturing biodiversity and respect all forms of life rather than killing it. And that's the aspect of it. Maybe we have taken too much time into this presentation and different contribution from different people. Probably just to sum up this presentation, can we have some questions? Anyone who has got questions around the whole presentation from the beginning, around when we painted the science of it? If there are any questions relating to the presentation, I've been trying to monitor the chat box, but I haven't seen any. So I think it's good to hear from this plenary session if there are any questions that needs any particular response. So you can be posting the questions and on the chat box, but if you have any, you can just show up and we'll give you time to air up your question briefly.
Yes, thanks, Shepherd. I think due to time, we'll give it like 5 minutes and then we'll break for 10 minutes. So if anybody has 1 or 2 questions or comments or highlight from this very rich presentation from Shepherd, that's the time now, and then we'll break for 10 minutes.
Hi, Steph. I just wanted, in terms of time, where to finish. When are we expecting to finish the sessions?
Yeah, I wanted to announce that at the break, we have another entire session on AE practices, which is also quite dense, but not as long as this one. So I think we'll definitely get beyond 2:45, probably up until 3:15, maybe 3:30, unfortunately. I hope some of you can stay with us. Otherwise, there's also the option of watching the recording on the YouTube channel.
Thank you.
So any comments, feedback, something that resonates, something that you learn? Okay, there's a question in the chat box, Shepherd, or maybe Stan, if you want to ask the question verbally.
Yeah, maybe we can hear from Stan the question directly from him.
Okay, good day, everyone. And thanks for the good presentations. I just wanted to find out, mainly the farmers in our communities, they are chasing a lot of things. For example, they are chasing profitability, and what is promising them the profitability is this industrial agriculture where you've got to use genetically modified seeds, and you end up having to use chemicals so that your yields are improved, and then you can get a better yield. You go to the market, you get a better return, so that you are able to meet the demands of life. So when we look at this eco-agriculture or organic agriculture, the yields are not as promising. And currently, you would find that the input costs are quite high for the farmers. So how do we make this affordable or sustainable to the farmer?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Stan, for that question, for a brilliant question. I think my response to that one is the most important thing that we need to understand about agroecology as a system is we are moving from a conventional system. Farmers will be moving from a conventional system to an agroecology system, and that transition period is not something that happens automatically. We need to acknowledge that there's a transition process that goes on. And in the transition process, we are also trying to manage the different economic aspects of it. But the most important thing is to have an understanding of how we can have a starting point, which is based on the resources that a farmer can be having at that particular moment and can actually be utilizing to move on. So in terms of affordability and the economics of it, it is provided for based on the available resources that the community that, and it is always good not to make a direct comparison of conventional and organics in terms of the finances or in terms of outputs, because the moment we do that, we are forgetting that this is a systems approach. It's not only one output that we are looking at. We are looking at different aspects. When you talk of the finance now, we would have not talked about the soil life. We would have not talked about the healthy of the plant that you are producing from there. So you need to have a very good comparison. I think more of that can actually be explored even further in the chat box if you further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Shepherd. And I think also the other Sky team people, yeah, as Shepherd said, maybe you can also answer in the chat box if you've got some other things to say about Stan's question. There are two more questions in the chat box, Shepherd, one from Heather and one from Florence and Rikai. So I don't know who wants to go first. And after that, we'll just stop the Q&A session, but you can still use the chat box to ask your questions to the person. So Heather, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I was just asking the question. It's trying to change people's mindsets, really, because people have been indoctrinated with, you know, fertilizer is best, it gives the best yield, etc. Hybrid seeds are best, and so on. So, I mean, we're looking at that transition period that you've just been talking about, but it's convincing them really that it is the best way forward and the most sustainable way forward. I mean, I think our conclusion really is that we have to do it ourselves to prove to people that this will work. But I think many people don't believe that it will work. And of course, a good yield is very important for their food security. So what's your suggestions really in how to go about it, that transition that you were talking about?
Okay, thank you, Ida, for a good question. I think my response to that one would be, it's when you're dealing with people and their systems, there's no particularly straightforward response or a response that fits best in every situation. But what we then do is to say, in trying to convince people, you use what are called participatory extension approaches, where you engage the people that you want to convince and work from their context and convince them from their particular context that they are working with. That's the best way to win. And you need to probably explore more on participatory extension approaches and engaging the people in participatory manner, and they contribute towards their own development. I think that's basically, in summary, out of time, we can also explore.
Thank you very much.
Lawrence, you've got a hand raised. I don't know if you want to answer to some of the questions or whether you have a question yourself.
No, thank you, Steph, and thanks, Shepard and everyone. I just want to go back to Stan's question of high yields on GMOs and very low yields on agroecology products. I differ on that one because the way we measure the output in a conventional system, we cannot compare it with our own agroecological farming system. And in the conventional system, you only plant one crop in a space, but in our agroecological space, you plant as more than 3 crops in a space. The challenge is the political will of supporting the small-scale farmers or the agroecology farmer to get their land in a way that they want it to be. And there's no cost. There's not enough, no high cost, input cost in the agroecology practices when compared to conventional systems. So we need to look at that in a different view, as well as what Precious has said. If you look at the reductionist view, that is what you get as an answer. But if you look at a holistic view, you'll get a better results and a good food for your people. Thank you. We can debate more on it.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. I suggest that we take Rikai's question, and then Shepard, if you can respond later to Florence's question on indigenous knowledge in the chat box, because it's quite clear, so maybe you can respond there. But Rikai, please ask your question, and that will be the last question for our session.
Okay, thank you for the space to ask a couple of questions. So I think one of the questions I wanted to ask is, in the context of urbanization and the ideas of shortening supply chains and supporting sustainability, are there any thoughts or any thinking around applying agroecological systems in urban areas? I thought that's interesting in the context of Southern Africa. And another question I had is, what can the role of policy be? And when the benefits of agroecology are very clear and very promising for major, I think, agenda items, you know, how come policy hasn't really responded in a strong way, and how can they be convinced to respond in a strong way? And the final question is just about scale. So in terms of like farm sizes and so on, what scale can agroecology be done at? How big, how small, and maybe what mix? Sorry, it's a bunch of questions.
Okay, thank you for a bunch of questions. Probably from the team, I might be responding to some and leave some for others to probably give their also input, but I'll just touch on on those. I think in terms of, I'll touch on policy and outscaling, and then someone can also pick it up from urbanization session. And in terms of policy, I think policy have got a very big role in supporting this whole initiative. If you realize that issues to do with indigenous knowledge and indigenous knowledge systems, it's mainly a localized knowledge that is within local indigenous communities, and there's not been much effort in terms of researching involving farmers or involving communities in that particular area to know more about those particular areas. So policy needs to support how indigenous knowledge and communities would tell. I've got a very good example of a research that was done in Chimanimani as a result of Cyclone Idai that struck the last year. Indigenous communities had indications of the cyclone coming from their indigenous knowledge, and some take heed of those indications and they took action. But those indigenous knowledge has not been researched on, has not been explored, and some of the things that needs to be supported by the policy and also be acknowledged. And then in terms of outscaling, in terms of the scale to which we can operate, the scale is really determined by the goals and the resources that we can actually have. But my encouragement has always been to start on a small scale, relatively small scale that is manageable, and using the resources that we have, and build on those resources to create an efficient system, and then outscale based on an efficient system that we have created. Probably someone can assist on the urbanization, maybe Lawrence or someone.
Okay, Vanessa, or maybe John Zira, can you assist on the urbanization question, or if you want to complement what Shepard said on policy?
Yeah, I'd like to say something on the policy environment, and it might be different in other countries from South Africa, but I'm sure it's similar. And that's a very strong lobby coming from corporations to promote their product, and they've created a narrative around production and productivism and the feed the world narrative that our decision makers have taken up, and they've convinced our decision makers that they have to go with the industrial way of agriculture in order to feed the growing population. And that's one of the narratives we really need to counteract, because as we see, even when there is productive production and excess production, like in South Africa, it doesn't get to everyone, and it's not of a good quality, doesn't provide good quality food. So that's part of the policy problem that we need to deal with. And there's a lot of lobbying that happens at our national levels and also internationally that's promoting that viewpoint and undermining agroecology. We've also seen institutions like the Cornell Alliance for Science that promotes sort of put out media around the problems with agroecology. They try and undermine us by saying that we impoverishing Africans and confining them to hunger. And they had a debate recently where they had someone who called the agroecology that social movements are talking about as radical, that other radical agroecology. That's crazy, because social movements are the ones that have promoted agroecology. And then for urban side, I think there's a lot of space for urban agriculture, and in cities and towns there's a lot of leftover space or spare space that communities can take up and can implement a range of practices that are agroecological and feed themselves. And we can certainly learn lessons from places like Cuba, where they implemented agroecology in rural areas, collectivized land also to implement it at a scale, and took it up in urban areas to produce food where people actually are. And urban areas also generate a lot of the biomass that needs to go back into the land. So it's very crucial that we do produce more food in urban areas. And if John wants to add to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the situation of urbanization related to agroecology, we need to address it in a way that in urban areas, there are so much activities of agroecology, and because they are accessible, there is access to waste that is produced within urban areas. And that waste is converted into fertilizers or control pesticides for controlling pests. And all these are organic waste that is produced, that is converted into food for the plants. Hence, in urban areas, we have noticed in this COVID-19, for example, we tend to find out that many people in the urban areas, they start to grow their own food through agroecological means. And those who have been participating in agroecological activities, either in rural areas, especially in South Africa, and either in urban areas, they had good markets of selling their produce because the demand is high. In urban areas, that's where we have more controlled or more organized markets on agroecology. So there is a growing or mushrooming of agroecology practices and growing of food in urban areas. Upscaling, this agroecology has been there for many, many years, hundreds of years. It's just the push that was done with industrial agriculture. So it is easy to upscale as long people are informed or are respected on the work they are doing on agroecology. And with a reduction of or a push of government introducing synthetic chemicals in the community, if we ignore that, we are able to drive agroecology to the right heights. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vanessa and John, for your inputs. I think I can also add on the scaling up aspect, just to share, like, even if in Southern Africa, it sounds like a huge obstacle for promoting agroecology. In other parts of Africa, they're far more advanced in terms of getting government on board and policy changing, like in West Africa. So showing the way, basically. But there's also a very interesting experience in India, in the state of Andhra Pradesh, where within 5 years, working together, government, scientists, farmers, NGOs, they've worked with farmers to make them adopting agroecology practices. Up to, I think it's 600,000 farmers that are now practicing agroecology in that state. And the objective is to reach the 1 million in the next 5 years. So if you Google it, now it's called, the name is now called Community Managed Natural Farming in India, but the previous name of the program was Zero National Budget Farming. So it's very well documented because, as I was saying, scientists are also involved and there is a political agenda. So we're trying to also make linkages with them so that, yeah, we get inspiration and we start engaging our policymakers to show that it's possible to scale up agroecology up to 1 million farmers. Okay, so I think unfortunately we have to stop there. I can see there's lots of activity in the chat box now. So I'll ask the Sky team to answer the questions that are popping up in the chat box during the break or after the break, so that everybody feels listened to, but very interesting questions. Thank you so much for your interest and your engagement.